What you know, alibis? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. It is Friday, May 2nd. Hope you guys have something fun planned for the weekend. Maybe you're going to chill, kind of like me, but it's here. Y'all, by lunchtime today, I needed a Valium because this cross exam was tense. So let's jump right in. The defense wants to go back to where Jen was watching the SUV out the front door. Jen says she wasn't watching, but she did see it. He mentions the time frame that she last saw the SUV past the flagpole was 12:45, but Jen can't be sure. So he hands her a transcript from some prior testimony she gave in June of 2023. He says, "You did send a text at 12:45 and you last saw it. And you know that because you sent a text." So he goes on to read from her prior testimony. "You said, 'I think my husband and I were talking about what they were doing.' I sat back down, and I think at one point I said hello at 12:42. 'Where are you?' I don't know if that was my last text or I did one more. 'Yeah, 12:45, hello, question mark,' because they were still there. And the question that was asked of her back then after she said this was, so the dark SUV was still there at 12:45. Her answer at 12:45. Back in real time, the defense asked Jen, "Do you remember that?" She says she's been asked a lot of questions about that, but those words, no. "I do remember saying, 'I think,' in there." The defense says, "But you said it was 12:45 when you last saw the vehicle." Jen says, "I think I said, 'I think.'" So he hands her a transcript. They read through that same exchange again, and he repeats, "You answered, you last saw it at 12:45. Jen again says, "I said, 'I think.' That's part of what I said." When you got the 4:53 a.m. call, you were asked by Trooper Prince on February 1st, 2022, who you communicated with. Did you tell Trooper Prince you talked to Karen Reed? Jen doesn't know exactly what she said because she spoke to so many officers. So he gives her the report. You said you had a conversation with Karen on John's niece's phone, and at some point you called Julie Albert and Tom Beatty. She said she didn't talk to Tom because no one answered. The defense, then you spoke to the grand jury about the same issue. You were consistent with you spoke to Karen and then Julie Albert. Objection sustained. Who did you tell the grand jury you attempted to communicate with? Jen doesn't know exactly what she said, but she knows she spoke to Karen. She said, "I've been at many grand juries. I don't remember specific questions or answers, but yes, Karen called me." What did you tell the grand jury about who you tried to communicate with? Jen says, "If you want to show me, I know the answer to the question, but I don't know what I said that day. I've testified multiple times. I've been interviewed by many officers, and I can't tell you what I said on what day. So to pinpoint one thing, it's a bit of a challenge for me. But what I can tell you, what I remember from that day, which I'm sure is very similar to what I testified to because it's the same." So he hands her a transcript. "What you told the grand jury?" And Jen said, "I communicated with Karen and called Julie Albert and Tom Beatty. At the grand jury, you didn't need to see a report, did you?" Jen said, "People ask questions in a different way. If you ask me, I will always say I talked to Karen and called Julie and Tom. The answer is always the same, but some of the words I use may be different." The defense, "That's what you told Trooper Prince as well, but you did make another call you left out of both of those statements. At 5:07 a.m., you called over to 34 Fairview." Jen said, "If it's in my phone records." Defense, "You called Nicole Albert's phone, and that call lasted 38 seconds, and you spoke to your sister?" No. "So it went to voicemail?" She says, "I don't know. I never spoke to her prior to waking her up. And as days passed, I remembered, but calling my sister wasn't as important." Defense, "You testified at the grand jury months later, and you also left out you contacted your sister." Jen said, "There's nothing nefarious." Defense says, "I didn't say nefarious. Why would you say that?" She said, "You're insinuating it. You're trying to portray something that is nothing. You do acknowledge you called your sister's cell phone. Were you calling to alert her of something?" No. Later that morning on January 29th at 11:30, You had an interview with Trooper Proctor and you testified on direct. Karen just showed up at your house screaming. But you told Proctor when Karen was on the phone, you told her to come to your house? No. Defense. She said she wanted to search for John. You told her to come to your house and pick you up? Jen says, no, that's incorrect. There was never a plan for Karen to come to my house. He offers to hand her Proctor's police report, but she says those are his words or his summary. Defense says that's not my question. Would it refresh your recollection to look? Jen said, I know what I told him. I know what happened. I don't need to see the report. Defense. During that interview, you told Proctor while driving back to One Meadows after being picked up by Karen. That's when you said Karen told you she broke her taillight. Jen said, Karen told me in the morning at my house. Defense. What did you tell Michael Proctor on January 29th? Jen said that she told me she had a cracked taillight at my house. She mentioned it again on the drive back to John's. But when she was on the phone, she said it. And that's when my husband said we shouldn't drive with a cracked taillight. Defense. Proctor didn't write that in his report, so that's incorrect. Objection sustained. Defense. The drive to Meadows would have been around 5:30. Well after she backed out and struck another vehicle at John's. Jen says she doesn't know about that. He asked if she needs to look at the notes. Do you remember your words? And she says again, the taillight was cracked and missing pieces. The defense says we can do this all day. Would it refresh your recollection to look at his notes? And Jen said, no, it wouldn't. Are you telling this jury you deny saying to Proctor, you saw a crack? She said, I'm not denying it. He asked me multiple questions at different times. Defense. Is it possible you said it was cracked when you talked to him on the 29th? Jen said yes, and it had missing pieces. In the days after January 29th, were you and your family coordinating your version of events? No. Were you coordinating damage control about the language you'd use? No. Did you use a group chat to coordinate your communications with law enforcement and press? She said, I have a lot of group chats with family and friends. But you had a group chat specifically, including you, your sister Nicole, Brian, and Matt McCabe? Yes. So he brings in the text messages. The first set is from January 29th of 2022. These are between Jen and her sister Nicole. 7:54 p.m. Jen. Carrie talked to cops and kept simple. 7:56 Nicole. Okay, try to get some sleep. Talk tomorrow. 7:57. Any update? 8 o'clock. We'll get more information tomorrow. Don't want to text about it. Jen responds, right. 8:59. Nicole. Okay, text me in the morning or if you hear anything later. He hands her more texts. These are group text messages between Jen, Nicole, Brian, Albert, and Matt. And these are from February 1st. They start about noon and end around 5 or 5:30 that evening. I'm not going to say these names over and over, so I'll just say to the group. 12:52 from Brian to the group. Julie said Channel 4 is in D&E. By the way, D&E is a pizza and a sub shop that's owned by Chris Albert in Canton. 12:25, Matt to the group. Eating, I assume. Ask Chris to ask some questions. Tell them the guy never went in the house. The defense stops here and asks, what does tell them the guy never went in the house mean to you? Jen said she took that as John never came in the house. Defense, who's the guy? And Jen says John. The defense asked Chris to ask some questions. Jen said we were all looking to find out what happened, so Chris said to ask some questions. What do they know? The defense says an indication John never came in the house. And Jen says John never came in the house. So in response to tell them the guy never went in the house at 12:52, Brian responds exactly. Then Jen responds, oh my God. 12:53, Nicole. I assume it's just to eat, but Brian, if she's there, ask her what the deal is. 2:55, Jen to the group to ask if we've heard if she's in a mental hospital. 2:55, Jen to the group. Carrie is here going over timeline. Brian, I did hear that. Jen, And we handed the phone to Carrie. On the phone was Michael Proctor. 2:55, Jen to the group. She's telling him, meaning Proctor, everything. The word everything is in all caps with exclamation points. 2:55, Jen to the group. All the stuff. 4:35 for Matt to the group. Yep, if Karen pleads out, it will end. And if she fights it, it will be an episode. Nicole liked that previous text. And then from Matt to the group, Brian sitting separate. 4:55 from Brian, okay. 5:15, Jen to the group. You listening? The defense asked if Carrie was in your house being interviewed by the Massachusetts State Police, and Jen says yes. She doesn't know what the phrase you listening, who that was directed specifically to, but her husband and daughters were there. The defense says so Matt would be the only one there to listen, and Jen says yes. The defense says there was a phone conversation you were privy to from earlier in the day between Carrie and Proctor. Back to the text, Jen to the group, cops here again. 5:31, Matt to the group. That girl could write a book nonstop, and that's referring to Carrie talking to the police. 5:32, Jen to the group. I love it. Jen did admit they could hear different parts of the interview. Jen to the group. She's telling them everything. And Jen explains to the jury that when she said the word everything, it was what happened and Carrie's opinions. Nicole, good. Matt, going to miss the basketball game at this rate. Jen explains the police were still in the house and Carrie kept talking. The defense asked Jen, those were intended to be private, and Jen said, I handed my phone over. But she's asked, you didn't think the defense would get the text? Jen said, nope. Defense says that is a textbook example of witnesses colluding. The judge tells the jury to disregard the comment and the question. Defense, you were colluding with other witnesses, were you not? Jen says, I was not. Were you organizing statements to the police based on what you heard Carrie saying? No. You were reporting back what you heard Carrie say to the police? Jen said, I was telling them she was speaking to the police, and I told them some of the opinions she was saying. Defense, your statements were, I love it, in regards to Carrie talking on and on. She says yes. And she also admits to telling the group chat things Carrie had said. Defense, and you were happy with what she said after you created this timeline with her? Jen said the timeline had nothing to do with it. She was telling her personal opinions about Karen. Moving on to the visit to Michael Lank's house. Did you and Carrie discuss the visit to his house before you testified in the first trial? She doesn't remember. Under oath, you said you went from One Meadows to Lank's residence to drop off one of Carrie's daughters. You spoke to Lieutenant Tully about this visit on May 10th, 2024, before your testimony in the last trial, and talked about the trip to Lank's house. You indicated to Lieutenant Tully you went there with Carrie to pick up her daughter at the residence, not drop her off. Jen says she was with us at John's and we were dropping her off. Defense, you didn't say dropping off, so that would be an example of another incorrect report. Objection sustained. Jen said, I know she was with us at John's, so if he mixed up pickup and drop off, we had her with us and dropped her off. You testified 11 days later about this issue. After the interview with Tully, you said you dropped her off, not picked her up. Jen said, I know we dropped her off. Did you talk to Carrie regarding yours or her testimony about picking up or dropping off? Jen said, we both know what happened. I have no idea if we did. The defense says the reason this came up is because you were confronted with location data that you were at Lank's house for a period of time. Jen said she was asked and had completely forgotten because those days were a blur, but I remember we dropped her daughter off there. Defense, do you recall seeing something indicating you were seen there through GPS location data forms? No. Did he tell you he had been given GPS data from the defense that indicates you went there? I don't recall. Before the May 10th interview with Tully, had you ever reported you went to Lank's house on January 30th to anyone? Jen said she had completely forgotten about it. You indicated you sat outside in Carrie's car for the entire visit and didn't go in the house except to possibly use the restroom. She said she has a faint memory of going inside to use the restroom. Defense said you didn't see Sergeant Lank. What time of night was it? She doesn't know, maybe afternoon. So the defense has a 10-page document. The first page is a map dated January 30th. Jen identifies her house on that map, and the date and time is January 30th at 12:13 p.m. So let's go through this timeline he is introducing regarding her activities that day. 12:19 p.m., the location shows her at John's house. She left at 5:12. 5:21, location shows Jen at her house. She left her house at 5:28. 5:36 to 5:40 shows her at Fairview. 5:43 to 6:28, which is 45 minutes, shows her location at Sergeant Lank's. And the defense points out the driving time from Fairview to Lank's is 3 to 4 minutes. Then at 6:34, she's back at her house. You said you sat outside with Carrie and Sergeant Lank's wife for 45 minutes. I assume the car is running and it's freezing out. You get out to go to the restroom at one point, and the three of you didn't decide, let's just go in the house? No. You said you stopped as a pit stop to drop off Carrie's daughter, but you drove from your personal residence to Sergeant Lank's residence. Jen says what she remembers is leaving John's and dropping off Lexi. Defense: it wasn't an errand to drop someone off. You went from your house to Sergeant Lank's? Jen said no, we went to drop off Lexi. Defense: she was never at your house? Jen said we left Meadows and dropped her off. Defense: you went into the house and spoke to someone? No. In fact, you left your house and made a pit stop at 34 Fairview before you went to Sergeant Lank's house. Jen said they drove by slowly and stopped. Defense: you went in the house and spoke to someone? No. Why did you go by? She said her and Carrie stopped by to look. Defense: for 6 minutes? Yes. You didn't speak to Nicole? I don't think so. Is it possible? Jen said, like I said, we rode by to look. You did not go from one Meadows to Lank's. Jen said, I thought I had, and this isn't refreshing my memory. Defense: do you remember denying a year ago you ever stopped by 34 Fairview? No. Do you want to look at your prior testimony? Sure. So she looks, and the defense says you denied altogether going to 34 Fairview. She says, no, I believe the paper says I never stopped by, but we drove by. Stopping by and driving by meant something different to me. We drove by slowly, looked at the scene. Did you speak to Nicole? No, we were in the car. Me, Carrie, and her daughter. Defense: you did not drive from One Meadows to Sergeant Lank's house directly. Jen says her memory is that they did, but she knows what the paper says, but her memory is different. She said, I was in shock and things were foggy. He goes through that timeline again, one by one. She doesn't remember. Moving on to phone calls with Trooper Proctor. The span of these are from January to March of 2022. And you had a number of calls from January 29th through the 31st. First page starts with January 29th at 10:54 a.m. Received a call from Proctor. The duration of that was a couple of minutes. Then another at 12:49. January 30th, 9:51, Jen calls Proctor. 9:52, Jen calls Proctor. That duration, 22 minutes. Same day, 4:45, Proctor to Jen, they talk for 10 minutes. January 31st, 11:51 a.m., Jen to Proctor, the duration, 4 minutes. February 14th, 3:55 p.m., duration of 17 minutes. February 17th, 5:19 p.m., February 28th, 12:48 p.m., and 4:34 p.m. March 1st, 10:16 a.m. for a duration of 10 minutes, 4:51, 1 minute duration, and 5:06 p.m., 2 minutes, 5:50, 12 minutes. March 29th, 3:27 p.m., 4-minute call. The defense: Proctor was in your home January 29th for a formal interview. Brian Albert was also there. There are 14 calls with Proctor after that through the timeline we just went through. The records stop in March, but there's more between May and August. She said she doesn't know how long it went, but she knew they started talking again in April of 2023. October of 2023, you were interviewed by Lieutenant Tully, and you began talking to Proctor in summer of 2023, just before the October 2023 timeframe. Jen said that was in regards to something other than this case, and they never met. With Trooper Tully, you were asked about your relationship with Proctor, and Jen doesn't remember. He asked if you met with Proctor, and you told Tully you had never met with Proctor prior to September 2023. She says no, because he was in my house in January of 2022. Defense. So again, that would be an error on his part. Objection sustained. If you told Tully you never met Proctor before September 2023, would that be a truthful or untruthful statement? There was a sidebar. When they come back, did you tell Tully you had never met Elizabeth or Michael Proctor prior to 2023? Jen said, I never met Elizabeth. The judge tells the defense to move on. They go into phone calls to John O'Keefe on January 29th. On direct and cross, you said you had multiple calls in the early morning hours with John between 12:14 and 12:50 a.m. 12:14 and 31 seconds, Jen to John, 49-second duration. 12:18 and 47 seconds, John to Jen, 36 seconds. 12:29 and 44 seconds, Jen to John, 7 seconds. The record said it was answered, but Jen denies speaking to him and says the last conversation she had with John was 12:18. And the rest of these calls are missed, but we're going to go through the timeline. 12:41 and 10 seconds. 12:41 and 59 seconds. 12:43, 12:46, 12:47, and 12:50. Those are all calls Jen made to John that were missed. And the defense says, Ms. McCabe, these are 7 calls that were missed. She said, I think some of these calls were done inadvertently. Defense, you deny making them? She says, I don't deny, I just don't remember. Defense, you previously gave an explanation for the 7 missed calls, 19 minutes total. That's about every 2 minutes you're calling John's phone. What's your explanation? Jen said I was going back and forth to the door. I put my phone in my pocket. But the defense says previously you called it what? And Jen says a butt dial. But he says there were 7 in less than 20 minutes. She said I wasn't paying attention to butt dials. I was listening to music and talking to family. The defense says 7 times according to you. And Jen says according to the record. You're aware. You're looking at John's phone records. Jen said, I gave my phone and you could have seen them on mine. But the defense says not one of those butt dials were on your record. She said she was not aware of that. Defense, you were confronted about that at the previous trial. And then she remembers him asking that. Defense, when you dial somebody by mistake, it requires several steps. Jen says, I don't know, but I think it's very common to do butt dials. The defense says, but the phone requires biometrics or a passcode to open. Jen says, I could have been texting and left the phone open and accidentally called John. Defense, but you have to open the phone to make a call. She says she doesn't know, she would have to look. How often do you make phone calls? She says every day. You have to open the phone app from the texting app to call someone. Jen says she doesn't know. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe I hit the last call since I had talked to John. Defense, if you're in the messaging app, you have to do something extra. You have to open a separate app. Then once the app is open, you have to choose who to call. Jen says that's one way, yes. If you lock your phone after a text, you have to open your phone and engage your phone again? Yes. When you make a call that's missed, it goes to voicemail. Yes. Then you have to push the end button or the voicemails go on forever. That's 14 interactions. Make the call and end it. And you don't remember making a single missed call to John? She says no. As you sit here, do you deny making those calls? She says, I'm not denying it, no. January 29th, what time did you get home? She thinks after 2 o'clock, but she's not positive. She went upstairs and got on her phone. The defense asks, what application did you open once you got upstairs? She thinks it was a sports page, and the defense asks if it was through Safari. Yes. You opened the search engine? She says, I know, I Googled the sports page. Defense, you were searching sports? Yes. What time was it that you did that Google search? She does not know an exact time, but the defense says 2:27 a.m. She recognizes that time, but doesn't remember specifically from that night. Defense, you've been asked dozens of times about this, and she asks which one. He said, I didn't ask you about that. Was there a Google search at 2:27 a.m. on your phone? She asked to see the records. She doesn't know what time she was searching the sports webpage, and they go back and forth about this for a minute. She doesn't remember doing those searches, and he asks if she is denying. And she said, if you could show me these Google searches, I would appreciate it. So he puts it on the screen. You'll agree there was a search. Cost long to die in cold. Jen said that was done in the morning at the request of Miss Reed. The defense says that was not my question. Does that record indicate there was a search for that at some point? Jen says on that paper. The defense says, is there a search? Yes. You Googled that? Yes. You were on Google. A search at 2:27. Jen says, I don't recall that. The paper says it. Defense, at some point in the morning you searched it. And she says, after we found John. The defense, you searched 2 times. And you said when you searched, it was Karen yelling and shaking you to do that search? Yes. You've discussed this with Carrie Roberts the day after, before her testimony? Jen said, we don't talk about testimony. You were with her just before her testimony to the grand jury, and she verified your story that Karen asked you to search. Have you talked about Karen asking you to? Yes. Are you aware Carrie testified last week? She denied ever having heard that statement. There is an objection that's sustained. They go to a sidebar. He asked again, have you heard from any source? Carrie denied hearing that. Jen says no. So he pulls up dash cam video. He says, you're aware there's no video demanding a Google search anywhere in this case? Jen said, I don't know what cameras were where. You're aware there's no audio of her asking? You're also aware there's no one else who heard this. Jen said it was just her and Karen. Carrie at that point had gone off somewhere. The defense says, so it's your word only that Karen asked for that search. Then you compared and contrasted that timeline? Jen says, no, I told my version and someone was writing it down for us, my sister. The defense asks if her sister is there. So he has Jen point her sister out. The defense says she witnessed this timeline being prepared, and you spoke to Carrie several times about this case. Jen said just about what happened in the aftermath, but not specific details. You instructed Carrie to say she heard Karen to ask you to Google. You wanted some witness to back up your story? Jen says, Karen said it. It's that simple. The defense says, you're the only one saying that. Jen says, yes, and I stand by that 110%. Defense, is the reason you wanted someone to back up that statement is because that Google search, how long to die in the cold, points a very uncomfortable finger right towards you? She said, I never did that search. I wouldn't need to instruct someone. I'm sorry. The defense asks, has someone told you to apologize when there's an uncomfortable question that you need to answer? Jen says no, and that's not an uncomfortable question to answer. He asked her, how many times did you say I'm sorry on cross? And Jen said, I didn't count. Defense, the Celebrite extraction determined of the 3 searches, only one was reported as deleted. Objection sustained. Have you ever been confronted with deleting a Google search on your phone? She says, yes, by you. Do you deny it? She says, I deny it. Yes. 6:03 a.m. when you, Carrie, and Karen approached 34 Fairview. Do you recall my client when the first officer on scene asked the question about what happened? And she does not. Do you remember my client a few seconds later saying, my boyfriend, I left him, he never came home? And he shows dash cam video. And he asked Jen if she heard that. Jen said she heard a female, but she couldn't tell what she was saying. The defense plays a few clips of dash cam video. They're pointing out in each clip that she is the one talking to law enforcement. What was your reaction when John was put on the gurney? You turned your back. Jen said it wasn't on purpose. You immediately recognized this was an emergency situation. He was a friend of yours, a police officer dying in the snow. You needed to get immediate medical attention to him. Minutes and seconds counted. That's why you called 911 at 6:03. An officer got there at 6:10. On that 911 call, you said it was a man passed out in the snow. You didn't say, "This is my friend." Jen said she wanted to give them information she thought was most important. The defense asked, "Did you say his name?" She said eventually in the call she does. You didn't say he's a Boston police officer. Do you think that may have sped things up? And Jen says, "I think they come equally." Can you think of any person on that road who may have had training to help John? She says, "I can now, but did I then?" Then my focus was on John. Defense, at 34 Fairview, there's a first responder. She says, "Yes, my brother-in-law, Brian Albert." And you didn't go in the house, did you? No. You went in later? Jen said our focus was on John. You knew his window was 30 feet away. She said it was actually off to an angle. You knew John was clinging to life, and you knew Brian Albert was a first responder. She said, in that moment, my only thoughts were John. Did you know there were warm blankets inside and you didn't go in? She said, no, I went to John and Carrie asked me to take over compressions and 911 was on the way and I never thought to go in the house. Defense, but you pulled out your cell phone, you called 911 and then you called your sister? She said, yes, I was calling to see if they could come out, but I was going over to work on him. Defense, you could have walked 25 feet to scream for Brian to help. She said that would have taken me away from John. You made these calls while John was clinging to life. And Jen said, I called to see if she would answer. Defense, she didn't answer. And you have a situation where John is laying dead or dying in your sister's front yard. There's no lights in the house. Jen says they were sound asleep. But you didn't know they were asleep. Your sister didn't answer the phone twice. Did you think to go inside to see if they were okay? Jen said I had no reason to think they weren't okay. Defense, nobody is coming out with Karen screaming and yelling. And Jen says Karen was yelling, I hit him and I have a cracked taillight. The defense says you solved the case right there. She says, I know John didn't come into the house. I wasn't concerned for anybody's safety in the house. Defense, the reason you didn't go inside is because you knew better. They weren't in peril. And Jen said something happened on the front lawn and not in the house. Defense, you weren't worried because you knew what really happened. She said at that moment, I didn't know he was hit by a vehicle and that there were tail lights all around him. So that was it for Cross. And then Brennan was up for redirect. He asks her to describe the weather when she got to Fairview after leaving Waterfall. She said snow was falling and it was starting to accumulate on the street and the windshields. But when they left, it had accumulated more to where her husband had to clear the windshield. When they came looking for John, it was dark and snow was blowing at them as they drove, so it was hard to see. From when you first saw John and went into your sister's home, is it fair? A number of first responders arrive. Did they have sirens on? She doesn't think so. Your sister and brother-in-law never came out? No. Did anyone in the other houses come out? No. Have you been trained in emergency aid? She said 25 or 30 years ago. He has her describe her state of mind in the moment, which is shocked, scared, confused, anxious, wanting to get help for John. On the dash cam, you spoke to several law enforcement officers. Didn't a number of people from law enforcement call you that day? She said Proctor and more after that day for interviews and then for testifying at the grand jury and then trial last year. Did you ever refuse to talk to police or testify? No. He reiterates Karen asked her to make the search after John was found, and she says she did not search for that before then. He asks why go back to Fairview, and she said she really isn't sure. Have you ever inadvertently called someone on your phone? Yes. Did you purposely make those calls? She didn't think so. Did you reach out to John after talking to Karen? Yes, because she said he didn't come home. He brings in other texts from January 29th other than what the defense brought in. Brings up she called John. 4:59 to John. Karen is worried. We need to find you. 5:04. Please answer so I know you're okay. And these are text messages with other people later in the day where Jen says, my mind is racing. I have that awful feeling in my gut like I'm about to puke. Besides seeing the awful image, trying to wrap my mind around what happened to him. Another text to someone, 5:15. Okay, I'm trying to call people. I'll be in touch soon. She doesn't know who that was to. There was a message Jen's sister sent her the day John was found, which said, I love you. Don't beat yourself up. You did the best you could. The Commonwealth reiterates that before that night, she really didn't know Carrie, and their relationship since then isn't collusion. There was a text from Carrie to Jen. This is awful. Another one from Jen to Carrie. Every time I close my eyes, it's all I see. I feel like I'm going to vomit. I can't even. I know how close you two were. I can't imagine how hard this is for you. And Carrie says, you are also. It's awful, Jen. I'm in shock. Carrie to Jen. I'm literally having a wine. I don't know what to do to calm down. Jen to Carrie. I know I'm in shock. It keeps hitting me. 2:13 p.m. Carrie to Jen. I don't know even what to do. I'm so sorry for us both. Jen to Carrie. I talked to Peggy. I'm devastated for them. Jen says that part of her state of mind that day was also having to tell her children. Another text, she says she's trying to wrap her mind around what happened to John. She says nobody told her she couldn't rely on her family and friends. She's asked, who asked you to put together a timeline? She says Peggy O'Keefe. They show more texts of Jen to Carrie where she says she's trying to process that he's really gone and all the events that happened. And the Commonwealth asks, trying to recount for people asking you over the next couple of days, was that affecting the way you were remembering and thinking about things? Yes. There is a recross. You said on direct there were no sirens that morning, but they had their lights on. Yes. You said you never refused to speak to law enforcement, but when you were approached by the two officers who weren't connected to Canton or the Massachusetts State Police, you recanted and refused to answer any more questions. She said she met with them at some point after and cleared up misconceptions, but the defense says you stopped that first interview and refused to ask questions. Jen said, I stopped and said I was going to seek counsel. Were there any of the text messages you just read with the state in any of the group chats, including you, Brian, Nicole Albert, and Matt McCabe? No. The state ends this portion with a video of Karen in an interview saying they suggested maybe he was passed out on someone's couch, which is weird. We're not on a campus. Or he was sleeping with someone. There were multiple women in the neighborhood of Fairview John had been with, and one of them very recently before I started dating John. Another clip, I was with Jen and Carrie in the back seat leaning over the front two seats. I described this to everyone. John looked like a buffalo on the prairie. It wasn't a bush, a hydrant, or a dog. It was a weird shaped lump in the elements. I was looking to find him on the road, and the fear of what I was going to see, what was awaiting me, was as extreme a feeling as the grief of realizing what happened to him. There was a third clip that went to a sidebar. They didn't bring it in. The last witness of the day testified about Karen's blood alcohol level. Based on the blood draw at Good Samaritan Hospital, Karen's blood alcohol content around the time prosecutors say she hit O'Keefe at 12:45 a.m. could have been between 0.14 and 0.28. 0.08 is the legal limit in Massachusetts, and that was it for today. Holy moly, y'all. We will see what next week brings. I'll be live streaming every day, so come join us. And every night, I'll be recapping the day's best testimony. I hope you guys have a good weekend, and we will see you soon.